Hello, and welcome to Endor N-Gauge Model Railway. I'm Jonathan. In my last video, I installed Endor in its new home on a temporary frame. Well, it didn't take very long for me to get a bit annoyed with its shortcomings. I found that I kept bumping into it where it jutted out from the door, and the wood was too thin to securely attach point switches or plug sockets. So I bought the right wood this time, 46mm wide rather than 19, and set about moving things out of the way, disassembling the first frame and detaching the back of the sofa from its base and removing its legs. I tried to build the new frame around the sofa bits, but there wasn't enough space for that, so I built it fully and then took it apart enough to get the sofa inside. The sofa probably isn't going to be used for a few years, but it will see use again one day, so for now, it's part of the railway. Once again, I was very satisfied to have Endor on a frame, but this time it doesn't look like a wreck, it's stronger, and there's more floor space. Happy with the frame, I could move on to attaching the point switches to it somewhere. I tried a few locations and orientations that looked plausible, and settled on one that had the least jutting out. The short ends of the switch boxes are almost exactly the same size as the width of the frame, and the screw holes stick out just enough to go directly into the frame. I detached the lever boxes from their makeshift wooden frames that had served well for the last few months and started to think about wire connections. Compared with how I'd been using them before, the switch layout would be rotated 180 degrees, so I needed to detach them all and rearrange them. The switches only come out of the box one way, so I had to disconnect all of the cables from the switch contacts. Some were quite hard to remove. Some pulled the switch contacts part way, as seen in this clip, and one actually pulled the contact completely out. I found that I couldn't push the contact back into the switch, so using a small screwdriver I levered the switch open. I opened it carefully, but the bits inside jumped out of their places. To see how the pieces should go together, I opened another switch, but much more carefully. I was able to see how things should be, but they came apart in that one too. I successfully reassembled the first switch and then thought I'd film reassembly of the second one. The switch arm rotates on a stub and pushes down against a spring-loaded rocker. The thin end of the rocker goes through a washer and then slightly out of a hole in the bottom of the switch. I found that two parts of the reassembly are tricky: getting the rocker in its washer to locate into the hole, and then getting it to stay in place whilst getting the lever to press into it. For this switch there was a moment where I didn't have my finger over the pieces and they fired off. I found the spring, but the washer is lost somewhere in the railway room, probably for a long time. The hole in the end of the switch looks narrower than the spring, so I decided to carry on without the washer and see if it worked before buying a replacement. I found that trying to get the lever onto its stub without the other part of the case in place was too difficult. It compresses the spring and so the bits all want to fly apart. Instead, I got the pieces roughly in place and pressed the switch case over them with a little bit of pressure, then slid the lever in until it went over the stub and I could click the case shut. Happily, that lever's been working just as well as before. I decided to keep the existing cables for the switches. Whilst I won't be regularly detaching them anymore, it's still good to have the option to do that easily. I've been enjoying having the switches anchored to something more solid than before. We'll see if they survive a slightly jutting out position in the long term. I expect they'll get an occasional accidental knock. In my last video I talked briefly about issues with my new JHA wagons. I gave links to fixes that Mark at Piddle in the Marsh had applied, and I've now applied some of those to these wagons. One, and I think only one, of the 13 wagons rolled freely out of the box. Here's a simple comparison of it against a more typical wagon. The simplest improvement was to slot small washers onto the bogies to give them enough clearance from the wagon body. These are 0.5mm thick washers, but I didn't notice to start with that they're too wide to slide all the way down the bogie's shaft, so at the moment they're actually giving more like 1.5mm clearance until I trim them. But sufficient clearance from the wagon body isn't the only issue. Most of the 26 bogies don't roll very freely at all. Here's a comparison of the best and the worst. I needed the magnifying glass now. Looking down on the bogie, I could see that at least 6 of the 8 brake shoes had clearance from the wheels, but 2 of them looked like they might not. But these shoes are curved. Looking at them closely from some other angles, I could see that they weren't touching the wheels. There was some plastic sticking out from one side of one of the wheels, so I wondered if that was rubbing against the bogie. I trimmed that off, but it didn't make any noticeable difference to how freely that axle spins. Another fix that Mark applied to his JHAs was to remove the horizontal bar on some of the bogies to stop them from being too tight for the wheels. I tried a similar thing. I cut the bar but didn't remove it. The change isn't visible, but should release excess tension. That only made for a very minor improvement in rolling, so I only did that to a few bogies. On some of the bogies it was the other end where the wheels didn't rotate freely. I verified the issue is with the bogie by swapping wheels around. I tried a bit of oil on some axles, but it didn't seem to make a noticeable difference. I've seen several suggestions about improving the axle bearing area of the bogies. I tried to deepen them with an awl on 1 or 2 bogies, but that's not the tool for the job. Ewan from Blackwood N-Gauge told me the tool for this job is a reamer. I immediately ordered some DCC Concepts ones. I gradually added improved wagons to a train pulled by my little pannier tank. Improvements to the rolling of the wagons will be obvious with this loco. At the moment it's fine with 4 and can just about manage 5, but that's its limit. The Class 60, however, is, as you'd expect, much more powerful and can now pull all 13 wagons, even though quite a few of the axles still don't rotate very freely. It's harder to tell if the 60 is slipping though, so I ran it light engine, then with some of the wagons, then with all 13, and compared how long it took to do a loop. Here I've overlaid it running light and running with a full load. In both cases it was on speed step 10 of 28, sound was off, and it had a rolling start. The wagons have definitely slowed it down, but not by much, so I don't think it's having much trouble. Success! That said, this method of measuring success might be void if the DCC chip uses back EMF to measure speed, because in that case it would use more power in order to try and maintain a consistent speed. I'll need to look into that. I've actually got another 3 of these wagons on the way. Hopefully, once the axle reamer arrives, that will make for another step change in the free rolling and allow nice long trains to run. Last week I was surprised that Graham Farish Class 220 Voyagers became available to buy, and I decided to get one. It soon arrived, so I temporarily switched the layout to DC power to test and run in the Voyager. This is a 4-car set, one of which is motorised, and I think it must be old tooling because its DCC sockets are 6-pin. It certainly doesn't have any special features. It's 59% more expensive than a Dapol 4-car HST set, 58% more expensive than a 5-car Dapol Super Voyager, and 80% more expensive than a 5-car Peco IET. It did not work very well. The wheels didn't roll freely on the non-motorised carriages, particularly so on the end car. After the issues with JHA wagons, that makes for a bit of a theme for new stock in the last few weeks for me. Here's a comparison of how freely the Voyager coaches roll compared with the Dapol Light Bar Ready Mark III coach. After it's running in, I tried the motorcar at full power. It didn't look fast at all, and that's before trying to connect it to the highly resistant non-motorised carriages. This is no good for a model of 125 mph express train. I checked the track power to make sure it was getting a decent voltage. When at full power in reverse, it made a screeching noise, and that's after it's running in. I found it extremely difficult to connect the carriages together. I managed to get 3 of them connected, but gave up trying to connect the power car to the rest. I think the coupling mechanism basically isn't fit for purpose, one of the critical purposes being that a person can connect them together. I had expected a Graham Farish model to be of a high standard mechanically as well as visually, but this is far from it. Given the number of issues and the significant price hike, I decided to return this model for a refund. I don't think it's worth the price. I've had a Dapol Super Voyager on pre-order for a year and 4 months, and counting. I hope that one will work when it eventually comes. Although I have found Graham Farish models to generally be more likely to work than Dapol ones, this isn't the first time I've had to return a Graham Farish model. My first brand new Graham Farish model in the last 15 years was a sound-fitted Class 08, which I received in May 2022. It was an awful runner. It kept stalling. This was before I'd started filming things for YouTube, but it behaved a lot like the one shown on Ian's Engage channel, so I'll put links into a couple of his videos. I found that often to get it going again after a stall I had to push it sideways on the track rather than along the track. When I held it upside down and gently pushed wheels sideways, it showed that the pickups lost contact with the wheels. I also took a close look at the track where it was most prone to stalling. You can see here that the Peco points have a recess in the stock rail, so that might have caused lateral movement in the wheels. These models were sold out on pre-order within a day or two of announcement, so the model centre sent it to Bachmann for repair. Since it came back to me, it's worked beautifully, but the repair list was a replacement printed circuit board and speaker, a replacement for a missing body screw, and wheel cleaning. Quite a significant list for a brand new loco. Considering it was sound-fitted, I don't think the Class 08 was extra expensive compared with other locomotives, but the Voyager is in a new league of expensive, along with the Mark I and Mark II coaches announced in the Graham Farish Summer 2023 range. If prices are going up by 50% along with a decrease in running quality, then I think my Graham Farish collection might be complete, at least for brand new items. I think that's a big if though. It hasn't been long since I received the 4F and Class 60, both of which have continued to be excellent and neither of which were unusually expensive. The locomotives announced in the Summer 2023 range seem to have had a more moderate price rise, so hopefully Graham Farish locomotives at least will continue to be worth buying. Another improvement to the JHA wagons is a switch to magnetic hunt couplings. These were easy to install. I wasn't convinced they'd be strong enough to pull the whole train before all of the axles rotate as freely as they should, so to start with I only converted half of them. I'm keeping the Rapido couplings on the end wagons, so I tested the hunt rake with the standard rake and was pleased to find that the magnets are indeed strong enough. I then converted the rest of the wagons. Although the axle reamers are still in the post, I decided to see how well my other big diesel locos would fare with the full rake of JHAs. First was a Graham Farish Class 57. It didn't seem to have any trouble. Next was a temperamental Dapol Class 66. This one prefers to run backwards. It felt a lot lighter than the 57, so I didn't have high hopes. However, it did seem to be able to make it around with only minor difficulty. I think it struggles a little bit when all of the wagons are on the curve, and I think the layout is on a very slight gradient, so when it's at the back it's going slightly uphill, but it's still managed without a lot of fuss. Third was a Graham Farish Class 66. This is a lot heavier than the Dapol, and as with the Class 57, it didn't seem to have any trouble. Finally, another Dapol 66. This one is newer and works well, but feels just as light as the other one. Unsurprisingly, it fared fairly similarly. None of the locos needed a lot of power. I sent them around on speeds between 7 and 10 out of 28. Overall, this is a good result. It means all of my big diesels can pull this rate of 13, and if I can get all of the wagon wheels rolling freely, then they should be able to manage the full rake of 16 when those other wagons arrive. Well, that's a relatively busy 2 weeks in Endor's terms. Having the layout available all of the time is working well. That's all for now. Bye bye.